The Tyson family has built a $20 billion empire on a simple, brutal equation: flesh for money. From the backwoods of Arkansas, 4 generations of men, John H., Don John, and John R., have turned the act of slaughter into a global currency, processing 1 out of every 5 pounds of meat in America. But this fortune carries a heavy, toxic price. The family history is not a corporate timeline, but a dossier of violent abruptions and accelerating moral decay. The curse began with the founder, John H. Tyson, who was obliterated by a speeding train in 1967, his body crushed alongside his ambition. It passed to his son, Don, who industrialized animal suffering and treated his workforce as disposable biological machinery. And it haunts the current generation, where the heavy mantle of power has devolved into farce, with the newest heir found passed out in a stranger's bed, reeking of alcohol and privilege, while the company faced investigations for child labor. This is a bloodline where the distinction between livestock and humans has been erased, culminating in the ultimate horror: managers at a Tyson plant placing cash bets on which of their employees would die first during a global pandemic. They are the kings of meat, but their crown is rusted with the blood of the people they consume to get it. The 1967 crash and the rise of a ruthless tycoon. The Tyson Dynasty did not pass the torch in a peaceful boardroom ceremony. The transfer of power was dictated by the violent laws of physics. On a gray, freezing morning in January 1967, John H. Tyson, the 66-year-old patriarch who had hauled the family out of the Great Depression with a battered truck and a load of chickens, drove his automobile onto a railroad crossing near Springdale, Arkansas. He never made it to the other side. A speeding freight train, an unstoppable force of steel and momentum, slammed into the vehicle. The impact was catastrophic. The car was not merely damaged, it was erased. The crash killed John H. Tyson instantly, his body broken amidst the twisted metal and shattered glass. It was a gruesome industrial death for a man who had spent his life building a logistics empire. The irony was dark and absolute. The man who had conquered the highways of America to transport livestock was destroyed by the iron horse, the symbol of the old industrial age. The accident left his wife, Clora, a widow and the matriarch of a grieving clan. But the true shockwave was felt by his son, Don. There was no transition period. There was no mentorship. There was only the sudden silence of the father and the roar of the machinery he left behind. The death of John H. Tyson created a power vacuum that could have easily destroyed the company. In 1967, Tyson Foods was successful, but it was still a family operation, run on the instincts of its founder. With his head literally crushed in the wreckage, the brain of the operation was gone. The burden of survival fell immediately onto the shoulders of his son, Don Tyson. Don was 37 years old, a man who preferred the smell of chicken coops to the air of an office. Standing at the graveside, he inherited not just a bank account, but a complex living organism that required constant feeding. He inherited the debts, the trucks, the slaughterhouses, and the thousands of birds that were waiting to be killed. The suddenness of the train crash stripped away any innocence Don might have had. He realized that life was fragile, but the market was relentless. The chickens didn't stop growing just because his father was dead. The processing lines couldn't stop moving for grief. This moment hardened him. It taught him the central lesson of the Tyson bloodline: the machine must never stop. Forensic historians point to the 1967 crash as the moment the soul of the company shifted. John H. Tyson was a hustler, a trucker, a man who saw chickens as a way to feed people. Don Tyson, traumatized and emboldened by his father's violent exit, would view chickens differently. He would view them as biological units of profit. The blood spilled on the train tracks in Springdale acted as a grim baptism. It marked the end of the agrarian phase of the family history and the beginning of the industrial phase, an era where the violence of the slaughterhouse would be scaled up to global proportions. The train didn't just kill a man, it killed the last vestige of the small-town farmer, making way for the corporate tyrant. When Don Tyson ascended to the throne of the family empire in 1967, following the catastrophic decapitation of his father by the locomotive, the American business world braced for a chaotic transition. They expected a period of mourning, or perhaps the clumsy stumbling of a son who had grown up in the shadow of a founder. What they got instead was the emergence of one of the most ruthless, deceptive, and effective industrial predators in the history of capitalism. Don Tyson was a master of optical illusions. Unlike the buttoned-up CEOs of New York or Chicago who ran corporations from glass towers, Don ran Tyson Foods from the back of a pickup truck or a wood-paneled office in Springdale, Arkansas that smelled of tobacco and fried grease. His uniform was legendary, a tan khaki shirt and matching trousers, embroidered with the name Don on the breast pocket. To the untrained eye, he looked like a janitor or a truck driver or a low-level line supervisor. He cultivated the persona of a good old boy, a simple beer-drinking redneck who just happened to sell chickens. However, forensic historians and business analysts now recognize this khaki uniform for what it truly was: camouflage. It was a disarming tactic designed to lull competitors, regulators, and union organizers into a false sense of security. Beneath the aw-shucks demeanor lay a mind that operated with the cold, binary logic of a computer and the territorial aggression of a wolf. Don Tyson was not a farmer. He was an industrial engineer of flesh. He possessed a terrifying ability to detach emotion from the living creatures he monetized. While his father, John H., had viewed the business as a logistics challenge, getting the bird from point A to point B, Don viewed the business as a biological war. His enemy was inefficiency. His enemy was the natural limit of biology. And his weapon was a philosophy that would reshape the global food system: absolute, total control. The mantra that Don Tyson burned into the corporate DNA of Tyson Foods was simple, violent, and non-negotiable: grow or die. This was not merely a slogan for quarterly earnings. It was an existential threat he held over the heads of his subordinates and his competitors. Perhaps traumatized by the sudden, violent erasure of his father, Don operated with a pathological fear of stillness. In his worldview, stagnation was death. If you weren't eating your competition, you were being eaten. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Don embarked on a rampage of acquisitions that can only be described as corporate cannibalism. He did not seek to partner with other poultry firms. He sought to metabolize them. He targeted regional family-owned operations, companies that had been run for generations with a focus on quality or community, and he crushed them with the sheer weight of his supply chain. He utilized a strategy of predatory pricing, flooding specific markets with cheap chicken to drive local prices down to unsustainable levels. The local butchers and small-time processors, unable to bleed money as long as Tyson could, eventually folded. Don would then step in, buy their distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, and integrate them into the Tyson Borg. This strategy transformed the landscape of the American South. The diverse ecosystem of independent meat packers was wiped out, replaced by a monolith. Don Tyson's appetite was insatiable. He devoured Holly Farms. He devoured Valmac. He devoured Lane Processing. With every acquisition, the Tyson Way, a system of relentless speed and cost-cutting, was imposed on the conquered territories. The unique cultures of these acquired companies were erased, replaced by the khaki-clad conformity of Springdale. Don Tyson proved that in the meat industry, mercy was an overhead cost he was not willing to pay. Don Tyson's most lasting and devastating innovation was the perfection of vertical integration. In business school textbooks, this is described as owning every step of the supply chain. In the reality of the Arkansas countryside, it was the reintroduction of feudalism. Before Don's reign, many farmers were independent entrepreneurs. They bought their own chicks, bought their own feed, raised the birds, and sold them to the highest bidder at the market. Don Tyson destroyed this model. He realized that if he controlled the inputs, he owned the farmer. Under the Tyson system, the corporation owned the hatchery, the feed mill, the trucking line, and the processing plant. They even retained ownership of the birds themselves while they were on the farm. The farmer was reduced to a contract grower. They owned the land and the barns, meaning they carried all the debt and the mortgage risk, but they had zero control over their product. Tyson would drop off the chicks, often genetically weakened, and the feed formulated for speed, not health. The farmer was told how to raise them, when to feed them, and when to turn off the lights. If a farmer complained about the quality of the feed or the fairness of the pay, Tyson could simply threaten to cut them off. In a rural economy where Tyson was the only buyer in town, being cut off meant bankruptcy. This system turned proud, independent landowners into serfs on their own soil. They were sharecroppers in the 20th century, working grueling hours to pay off loans for massive chicken houses that Tyson demanded they build, while Don Tyson grew into a billionaire on the backs of their labor. The grower took the risk of weather, disease, and equipment failure. Tyson took the profit. It was a master class in risk transfer, ensuring that the blood and the bankruptcy stayed on the farm while the gold flowed to the boardroom. To feed his grow or die machine, nature itself had to be broken. The chicken of the 1950s was a scrawny, active bird that took months to reach market weight. It ran around, it foraged, it had a skeletal structure designed to support its mass. To Don Tyson, this bird was a defective product. It was too slow. It wasted energy on walking and living. Under Don's directive, Tyson Foods became a pioneer in the genetic manipulation of the avian species. They didn't use test tubes in a sci-fi sense, but they used selective breeding with an aggression that bordered on the grotesque. They engineered the Cobb 500 and other proprietary breeds, birds designed with massive chests because Americans preferred white meat, and voracious appetites. The result was the Franken chicken. These birds grew at a rate that defied evolutionary logic. A bird that once took 70 days to reach slaughter weight now reached it in 45, then 40, then 35. The biological cost of this acceleration was horrifying. The bird's internal organs often could not keep up with their muscle growth, leading to heart failure, known in the industry as flip-over syndrome. Their skeletal systems were often too weak to support their massive breasts, causing their legs to snap under their own weight. Millions of birds lived their short 6-week lives in chronic pain, unable to stand, lying in their own waste until the catchers came to throw them into crates. Don Tyson viewed these creatures not as animals, but as protein conversion units. If 5% of the flock died of heart attacks because they grew too fast, that was simply a calculation. If the remaining 95% got to the slaughterhouse 3 days faster, the math worked out in Don's favor. He had successfully industrialized the heartbeat. The final component of Don Tyson's machine was the processing plant itself. Before the Tyson Revolution, butchery was a skilled trade. A butcher knew anatomy, knew how to deconstruct a carcass with a sharp knife and minimal waste. Don Tyson realized that skilled labor was expensive and slow. He needed to de-skill the killing. He transformed the slaughterhouse into a disassembly line. The plants became vast refrigerated cathedrals of gore where chickens were hung upside down on shackles, stunned by electrified water baths, and dragged across automated throat-cutting blades. But the machines couldn't do everything. For the evisceration and deboning, he needed human hands. Don staffed his plants with the most vulnerable populations he could find, poor rural whites and later waves of immigrants and refugees. He treated them as biological extensions of the machinery. The line speed, the speed at which the shackles moved, was the god of the plant. Supervisors were incentivized to keep the line moving at all costs. Workers were forced to make the same cutting motion 10,000, 20,000 times a shift. Their wrists swelled, their tendons snapped, and their shoulders froze. Inside a Tyson plant under Don's reign, the floor was slick with fat and blood. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine, used to wash the carcasses, and awful. Workers were often denied bathroom breaks, forced to urinate on themselves to avoid stopping the line. To Don Tyson, a worker who needed to pee was no different than a chicken that walked too slow, an inefficiency to be eliminated. He built a system where the suffering of the animal and the suffering of the human mirrored each other perfectly. Both were ground down, used up, and discarded in service of the quarterly profit margin. By the time Don Tyson handed over the reins, though never fully the power, in the late 1990s, he had fundamentally altered the relationship between humanity and its food. He had turned the farm into a factory, the farmer into a serf, and the animal into a product. He washed the blood off his hands every night, put on his clean khaki shirt, and went to sleep, the undisputed emperor of the slaughterhouse. By the 1980s, Don Tyson had successfully turned Tyson Foods into a global protein engine. But every engine produces exhaust. In the case of the poultry industry, the exhaust was millions of tons of biological waste. Don's obsession with vertical integration meant that while Tyson owned the meat, the contract farmers owned the manure. This waste, rich in phosphorus and nitrogen, had to go somewhere. For decades, the Tyson machine treated the stunning landscape of the Ozarks not as a sanctuary, but as a sewer. Forensic environmental reports from this era describe the Illinois River, once a pristine waterway cherished by fishermen, turning into a murky, algae-choked soup. The sheer volume of chicken litter spread over the Arkansas and Oklahoma soil created a toxic runoff that poisoned the groundwater. This was not accidental. It was a calculated externalization of costs. To install proper waste treatment systems would have cost pennies per bird, threatening the grow-or-die margin. So the cost was passed to the ecosystem. Local communities began to report undrinkable water and dying fish populations. Don Tyson's empire was literally seeping into the veins of the earth, turning the geography of his home state into a toxic waste dump. The blood of the Tyson empire wasn't just in the slaughterhouse, it was in the water tap of every home downstream. Don Tyson's ambition did not stop at the slaughterhouse door. He believed he could buy the federal government just as easily as he bought feed corn. His philosophy was that every man had a price, and the United States Secretary of Agriculture was no exception. In the early 1990s, the Tyson curse entered the halls of Washington, D.C. via the Mike Espy scandal. Forensic investigators uncovered a brazen bribery scheme where Tyson Foods provided Espy, then President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Agriculture, with illegal gifts, tickets to NFL playoff games, scholarship money for his girlfriend, and lavish travel. In exchange, the company expected leniency on new, stricter federal inspection rules regarding fecal contamination in meat. When the scandal broke in 1994, it shattered the good old boy camouflage Don had worn for so long. It revealed a corporate culture that viewed the law as a nuisance to be bribed away. Tyson Foods eventually pleaded guilty to a felony charge of giving illegal gratuities and paid a $6 million fine. For Don, it was pocket change, a cost of doing business. But for the family name, it was a permanent stain. It marked Tyson Foods not just as a polluter, but as a corrupter of democracy. It established a precedent that the family considered themselves above the laws that governed ordinary citizens. By the late 1990s, Don Tyson was a billionaire, a kingmaker, and a living legend in the industry. But physically and reputationally, the cracks were showing. His lifestyle of hard drinking and relentless pressure was taking its toll. It was time to designate an heir. Did Tyson Foods secretly run a modern-day slave trade? The ascent of John Tyson to the throne of the family empire in the late 1990s was not a standard corporate succession, it was a resurrection. Born in 1953, John was the crown prince of a kingdom built on blood, but for the first half of his life he looked less like a king and more like a casualty. He grew up in the suffocating orbit of his father, Don Tyson, a man who possessed the gravitational pull of a planet. Don was a tyrant of industry, a khaki-clad warlord who thrived in the gore of the slaughterhouse and the backroom deal. John was a creature of a different frequency, sensitive, wealthy, and deeply uncomfortable in his own skin. Forensic psychologists observing the Tyson dynasty note a distinct fracture between the generations. The founder, John H., had the drive of survival. The builder, Don, had the drive of conquest. The heir, John, inherited only the burden. From a young age, John lacked the visceral killer instinct required for the kill floor. He was an artist trapped in a butcher's lineage. This dissonance created a vacuum in his soul, a hollow space that could not be filled with money, only with chemicals. While Don Tyson was busy conquering the American food system with his grow or die philosophy, John Tyson was waging a private war against his own DNA. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, John became known in Arkansas high society not for his business acumen, but for his legendary capacity for self-destruction. He was the party boy of Springdale, but this was not the hedonism of a happy playboy. It was the frantic self-medication of a man in pain. Alcohol and cocaine became his primary defense mechanisms against the crushing weight of the Tyson name. The contrast between father and son was stark and painful. The father was addicted to power. The son was addicted to oblivion. While Don was bribing federal officials and swallowing competitors, John was drifting in and out of a haze, a billionaire who was spiritually bankrupt. He was a man who had everything the world could offer, yet possessed no control over his own mind. This period marked the Tyson curse manifesting in the bloodline itself. The immense wealth extracted from the suffering of animals was now fueling the slow suicide of the heir. By the late 1980s, John Tyson hit rock bottom. His addiction had become a liability that even his father's immense influence could no longer conceal. In a move that saved his life but complicated the family narrative, John entered rehab. He emerged in the 1990s sober, determined to reclaim his birthright. This redemption arc was meticulously curated by the corporate PR machine. John was presented to Wall Street as the new Tyson, a reformed man, more modern, more corporate, and ostensibly more ethical than the rough-edged tyrant who raised him. When John took over as chairman in 1998 and later CEO, he attempted to scrub the grime off the family image. He replaced his father's khakis with tailored Armani suits. He moved the headquarters to a gleaming glass campus that looked more like a tech firm than a meat packer. He spoke of corporate responsibility and modernization, but underneath the new suit was the same old machine. John was a sober man attempting to drive a drunk car. He wanted to be a visionary leader, but the entity he commanded knew only one language: brute force. When Don Tyson finally relinquished control, he handed John a poisoned chalice. The company was a global behemoth, yes, but it was structurally addicted to exploitation. The relentless drive for lower costs, the very strategy Don used to build the empire, had pushed the domestic workforce to its breaking point. To keep the stock price up, the slaughter lines had to move faster. To move faster, they needed bodies. This was the economic trap that lay in wait for the new CEO. John inherited a business model that could not function without a steady supply of desperate, disposable labor. The local labor pool in Arkansas was exhausted. They were too broken or too wise to work the lines anymore. The machine was starving for hands. This reality set the stage for the greatest moral stain in the company's history. The Prince of Poultry, the clean-cut modernizer, would soon find himself presiding over a conspiracy to traffic human beings like cattle. The addiction to drugs was gone, but the addiction to cheap labor was just beginning. By the late 1990s, the Tyson Foods empire was facing a silent existential crisis that had nothing to do with chicken feed prices or consumer demand. It was a crisis of flesh. The grow-or-die philosophy instilled by Don Tyson had scaled the company to monstrous proportions, but the machinery of slaughter had a biological limit: the human body. The work inside a poultry processing plant is some of the most grueling, dehumanizing labor on the planet. Workers stand shoulder to shoulder in temperatures kept at a near-freezing 40 degrees, standing in a slurry of water, blood, and fat. They are required to make repetitive cutting motions, deboning a breast, slicing a wing, thousands of times per shift, often with dull knives, as the line speeds scream past at 140 birds per minute. This environment created a churn rate that defied industrial logic. In some Tyson plants, the annual employee turnover rate hit 100%. This meant the company had to replace its entire workforce every single year. The local labor pools in rural Arkansas, Tennessee, and Missouri had been exhausted. The locals, poor whites and African Americans who had historically staffed the plants, were broken. They had missing fingers, destroyed rotator cuffs, and chronic carpal tunnel syndrome. They were no longer willing to sell their bodies for minimum wage. John Tyson, the new CEO in the Armani suit, was staring at a mathematical impossibility. He needed tens of thousands of hands to keep the stock price up, but there were no hands left to hire. Faced with the choice of raising wages to attract American workers, which would destroy profit margins, or finding a new source of desperate labor, the corporate organism chose the latter. They did not just look for new workers, they looked for a new class of worker, one that was silent, fearful, and legally invisible. What followed was not a series of accidental hiring mistakes, but what the U.S. Department of Justice would later describe as a structured corporate conspiracy to smuggle human beings across international borders. This was the creation of a corporate underground railroad, designed not to liberate slaves, but to import a compliant underclass. The scheme relied on a complex network of recruiters, coyotes, smugglers, and temporary employment agencies that acted as liability shields for the main corporation. At the heart of this network was a figure who seemed lifted from a noir thriller, Amador Anchondo. A prominent smuggler operating out of the border regions, Anchondo became a key node in the Tyson supply chain. Forensic evidence gathered by the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, revealed that this was not a passive operation. Tyson managers did not simply wait for undocumented immigrants to show up at the plant gates. They placed orders. Plant managers in Shelbyville, Tennessee, and other locations were recorded requesting specific numbers of workers, treating human beings like raw materials to be procured. "I need 20 bodies by Tuesday," was the operational mindset. These requests would filter down the chain to the smugglers in Mexico, who would then round up impoverished villagers with promises of the American dream. The journey of a Tyson worker began in the dust of the Mexican borderlands. Smugglers would guide groups of men and women across the Rio Grande, often under perilous conditions, exposing them to the risk of drowning, dehydration, or assault by cartels. Once on American soil, the cargo was loaded into vans and buses. These vehicles did not drop the migrants off in random cities to find their own way. They drove them directly to the loading docks and personnel offices of Tyson processing plants in the American interior. This logistical precision is what elevated the crime from simple immigration fraud to human trafficking. The workers were often delivered with startup kits, fraudulent Social Security cards and green cards, often of such poor quality that the ink was still wet or the laminating glue was still sticky. Tyson executives and HR managers were fully aware of the fraud. In recorded conversations, they openly joked about the fake documents. One manager was recorded telling an undercover agent that he didn't care if the workers brought in a Social Security card written on a napkin, as long as they could hold a knife. The brutality of this system lay in the financial shackles it placed on the workers. The migrants did not arrive as free agents. They arrived in debt. The smugglers charged thousands of dollars for the crossing, a fee that the impoverished workers could not pay up front. In many instances, the arrangement mirrored 19th century indentured servitude. The workers would labor at the Tyson plant, and a portion of their meager wages would be siphoned off to pay the smugglers. Tyson Foods facilitated this ecosystem. By partnering with specific temp agencies that were run by the smugglers themselves, the company allowed the predators to garnish the wages of the prey. The workers were trapped. They lived in dilapidated housing, often secured by the smugglers or company intermediaries, rode in vans organized by the network, and worked in the plant. They were entirely dependent on the Tyson ecosystem for their food, shelter, and safety. If they tried to leave, they still owed the debt. If they complained, they were threatened. For the Tyson leadership, the undocumented worker was the perfect victim. The genius of the scheme was not just cheap labor, it was compliant labor. An American citizen or a legal resident has rights. They can vote to unionize. They can file complaints with OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, if a machine cuts off a finger. They can sue for sexual harassment. They can demand overtime pay. The undocumented worker, however, lived in a state of perpetual terror. Tyson managers weaponized the threat of deportation, known as La Migra, to enforce brutal production quotas. If a line supervisor wanted to speed up the disassembly line to dangerous levels, he didn't need to offer a bonus. He simply had to remind the workers that immigration was only a phone call away. This dynamic silenced the kill floor. When workers suffered debilitating injuries, amputations, chemical burns, chronic pain, they rarely reported them. They stitched themselves up, swallowed painkillers, and went back to the line, terrified that a trip to the hospital would lead to a trip back across the border. Tyson Foods had effectively successfully outsourced its safety costs to the bodies of the workers. They were extracting value from the physical destruction of human beings who had no legal recourse. The modern Tyson Foods that John Tyson was building was essentially a plantation system hidden behind a corporate logo. The impunity ended with an undercover federal investigation codenamed Operation Tipped Chicken. For 2 years, federal agents infiltrated the smuggling network. They posed as coyotes and recruiters, wearing wires into meetings with Tyson plant managers and HR executives. The recordings they captured were damning. They caught Tyson managers explicitly discussing the illegality of the hiring practices. They captured the voices of men who viewed the workers not as humans, but as fresh bodies to replace the ones they had broken. They documented the exchange of cash for smuggled workers. In December 2001, the Department of Justice unsealed a 36-count indictment against Tyson Foods and several of its top executives. The charges were severe: conspiracy to smuggle illegal aliens for commercial advantage and private financial gain. It was the first time in U.S. history that the federal government had targeted a Fortune 500 company with RICO-style tactics for immigration violations. The indictment shattered the curated image of John Tyson, the man who had spent millions on PR to distance himself from his father's khaki-clad tyrant persona, was now the face of a company accused of running a slave trade. The glass headquarters in Springdale was raided. The stock price wobbled. The public finally saw the true cost of their cheap chicken nuggets, a supply chain that relied on the systematic exploitation of the world's most vulnerable people. The Prince of Poultry had been caught with blood on his hands, not from killing chickens, but from trafficking humans. In February 2003, the federal government's case against Tyson Foods went to trial in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was billed as the definitive battle between the Department of Justice and corporate greed. The prosecution had wiretaps, they had cooperating witnesses, and they had a narrative that painted the Tyson boardroom as the command center of a criminal enterprise. But they underestimated the sheer brute force of the Tyson legal defense. John Tyson did not face the jury as a humble defendant. He faced them from behind a phalanx of America's most expensive defense attorneys. The strategy they deployed was a masterclass in corporate immunology. They did not deny that smuggling had occurred. They did not deny that managers had hired undocumented workers. Instead, they argued that the corruption was localized. They claimed that the executives in Springdale, John Tyson and his inner circle, were the victims of rogue mid-level managers who had gone off the rails. It was the bad apple defense executed with surgical precision. The attorneys painted the plant managers, the men who had actually been recorded ordering fresh bodies, as deviants who had violated the company's strict hiring policies. John Tyson was portrayed not as a smuggler, but as a distant, benevolent CEO who had been betrayed by his subordinates. It was a cynical gamble. Sacrifice the pawns to save the king. The strategy worked. On March 26, 2003, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury acquitted Tyson Foods and its top executives on all charges. The verdict sent shock waves through the labor movement. It established a terrifying precedent. A corporation could profit from a decade of systematic human trafficking. But as long as the CEO didn't personally drive the smuggling van, he was untouchable. Inside the courtroom, the Tyson executives hugged their lawyers. The stock price, which had been depressed by the scandal, rallied. John Tyson walked out of the courthouse, a free man, vindicated in the eyes of the law, if not in the eyes of history. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to for the billionaire class. The legal firewall held. The blood and the dirt stayed at the bottom of the pyramid. The profit rose to the top, clean and laundered. While champagne corks popped in Springdale, a very different reality unfolded for the human beings at the center of the conspiracy. The undocumented workers who had been recruited, smuggled, and exploited by the Tyson machine were not given acquittals. They were given deportation orders. In the wake of the investigation, thousands of workers were rounded up. Families that had settled in rural towns, enrolling their children in schools and trying to build lives in the shadow of the slaughterhouse, were torn apart. Fathers were sent back to Mexico. Mothers were detained. They were the disposable people. Tyson Foods had used their bodies to process millions of pounds of meat, extracted the prime years of their physical strength, and then when the legal heat got too high, discarded them like spent casings. There were no settlements for the workers who had lost fingers on the line. There were no apologies for the women who had been harassed by managers threatening deportation. They simply vanished from the American landscape, erased from the narrative. The smugglers, the coyotes, went to prison. The managers were fired. The workers were exiled. But the Tyson family kept the money. In the years following the acquittal, John Tyson embarked on a bizarre and aggressive campaign to rebrand the company's soul. Perhaps haunted by the scandal, or perhaps simply realizing that human trafficking was bad for the brand, he pivoted to religion. He instituted a core values program, hiring a fleet of corporate chaplains to roam the slaughterhouse floors, offering spiritual comfort to the workers. It was a surreal juxtaposition. Men and women standing in blood, carving carcasses at breakneck speeds, being ministered to by pastors on the company payroll. Critics called it industrial washing, using the veneer of faith to cover the stench of exploitation. John Tyson talked about honoring God in the boardroom, yet the line speeds didn't slow down. The pay didn't go up. The relentless demand for flesh continued. The Prince of Poultry had survived the greatest threat to his reign. He had beaten the federal government, but the victory was hollow. The 2003 trial proved that Tyson Foods was an entity that existed beyond morality, a machine that could consume human dignity and spit out profit without consequence. The curse had not been broken, it had simply been legalized. And as the new millennium marched on, the stage was set for the final, most grotesque chapter of the dynasty: a global pandemic, a betting pool on human life, and the ultimate collapse of the Tyson moral compass. Managers betting cash on worker deaths. On Sunday, April 26, 2020, as the United States lay paralyzed in the grip of the first terrifying wave of COVID-19, readers of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette opened their newspapers to find a stark, ominous message. It was a full-page advertisement, framed in black, written by John Tyson, the chairman of Tyson Foods. The headline screamed in bold capital letters, "The food supply chain is breaking." To the uninitiated public, terrifyingly locked in their homes and wiping down groceries with bleach, this read like a desperate warning from a concerned industrialist. John Tyson warned that millions of pounds of meat will disappear from the supply chain. He painted a picture of empty grocery store shelves, of a nation starving, of farmers being forced to euthanize their livestock because processing plants were being forced to close by local health departments. However, forensic historians and labor activists saw the letter for what it truly was: a ransom note. It was a masterclass in disaster capitalism. John Tyson was not asking for help to make his plants safer. He was threatening the American public. The subtext was brutal and clear. Let us operate without restrictions. Let us ignore the health ordinances. Let us sacrifice our workers, or we will starve you. This advertisement was the opening salvo of a coordinated political pressure campaign. Within days of its publication, President Donald Trump signed an executive order invoking the Defense Production Act, classifying meatpacking plants as critical infrastructure. This legal maneuver effectively stripped local health departments of their power to close infected plants. It gave Tyson Foods a liability shield, a license to kill. By framing pork chops and chicken nuggets as matters of national security, John Tyson had successfully argued that the profits of his family dynasty were more important than the lungs of his workforce. The plants would stay open, the line would keep moving, and the virus would be welcomed inside. The irony is sickening. Every design choice meant to keep the meat fresh. The freezing air, the tight spaces, the sealed walls turned the factory into a paradise for the virus. Tyson had built a fortress to keep bacteria out, but in doing so, they built the perfect home for COVID to settle in. First, there is the temperature. To preserve the meat and prevent bacterial growth, salmonella, and E. coli, the processing floors are kept at a near freezing temperature, usually around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. Research has shown that the SARS-CoV-2 virus thrives in cold, dry air, surviving longer on surfaces and remaining suspended in aerosols for extended periods. The very environment designed to kill bacteria was a paradise for the virus. Second, there is the noise, the industrial cacophony of a Tyson plant, the roar of the conveyor belts, the hiss of pneumatic cutters, the clatter of shackles is deafening, often exceeding 90 decibels. Workers cannot communicate at a conversational volume. To speak to the person next to them, they must shout. This necessity created a catastrophic biological mechanic. Every time a worker shouted to warn a colleague or ask a supervisor a question, they were expelling a high-velocity plume of viral droplets deep into the stagnant cold air. Third, and most fatally, there is the proximity. The grow-or-die philosophy of Don Tyson had maximized efficiency by packing workers shoulder to shoulder. On the deboning lines, workers stood mere inches apart, their elbows touching, breathing the same recycled air for 8, 10, or 12 hours a shift. Social distancing was a mathematical impossibility without slowing down the line speed, something Tyson executives refused to do. The result was a biological reactor. Once the virus entered a Tyson plant, it did not just spread, it exploded. It moved through the lines faster than the carcasses. It jumped from the debone line to the evisceration line, carried on the breath of men and women who were working so hard they were hyperventilating. The plant became a sealed box of infection, and the workers were trapped inside. As the virus began to tear through the workforce in April and May of 2020, fear gripped the Tyson plants. Workers in Waterloo, Iowa, Logansport, Indiana, and Wilkesboro, North Carolina, began to call in sick. They saw their colleagues coughing on the line. They saw ambulances idling in the parking lots. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Absenteeism spiked. Tyson Foods faced a crisis. They had the executive order to keep the doors open, but they couldn't force people to walk through them. Or could they? The corporate response was a cynical weaponization of poverty. Instead of offering paid sick leave to encourage infected workers to stay home, Tyson announced a policy that incentivized sickness. They introduced the thank you bonus, a lump sum of $500 to be paid to workers who did not miss a single shift for 3 months. For a refugee from Burma or a single mother from Mexico making $15 an hour, $500 was a life-changing amount of money. It was rent, it was food, it was survival. But the catch was absolute. If you missed a day because you felt feverish, you lost the money. This policy effectively forced workers to play Russian roulette with their health. A worker waking up with a sore throat and a dry cough faced a terrible choice: stay home and lose the bonus and potentially be fired for absenteeism, or take 2 Tylenol to suppress the fever, walk into the plant, and hope for the best. Tyson Foods had engineered a financial structure that guaranteed infected workers would come to work. They turned the desperation of their workforce into a biological weapon against the workforce itself. The thank you bonus was not a reward, it was a bribe to walk into a burning building. The tragedy of the Tyson COVID-19 outbreak cannot be separated from the specific demographics of the people who died. By 2020, the Tyson workforce was a United Nations of the dispossessed. In the Waterloo, Iowa plant alone, there were over 25 languages spoken. These were Bosnians who had fled genocide, Burmese refugees escaping ethnic cleansing, Congolese immigrants, and Mexicans seeking a better life. These populations were uniquely vulnerable. Many did not speak English well enough to understand the chaotic and often contradictory health guidelines issued by the CDC. Many lived in multi-generational households, meaning that when a Tyson worker brought the virus home, they brought it to their elderly parents and their children. The infection did not stay in the factory. It radiated out into the immigrant communities, turning tight-knit neighborhoods into funeral zones. Tyson management exploited this vulnerability. In many plants, safety signage was initially posted only in English. Translators were scarce. When managers held meetings to reassure workers that they were safe while standing without masks themselves, many workers simply nodded, not understanding the words, but understanding the tone. Get back to work or get out. The term essential worker was bandied about by John Tyson and the corporate PR machine as a badge of honor. They ran commercials praising the heroes feeding America. But inside the plants, the workers knew the truth. They were not essential. They were sacrificial. They were the fuel that kept the Tyson stock price from collapsing. The dynasty that had built its fortune on the backs of the desperate was now preparing to pile their bodies to build a firewall against economic loss. Where was the government? Where was OSHA? Where were the unions? In the spring of 2020, the regulatory state effectively collapsed under the weight of corporate lobbying. OSHA, the agency tasked with protecting worker safety, went silent. Under the Trump administration and heavily influenced by the meat lobby, OSHA issued guidance rather than rules. They recommended masks if feasible. They suggested dividers if possible. This lack of enforcement gave Tyson Foods a green light to prioritize production over protection. In the early weeks of the pandemic, workers reported being told they were not allowed to wear their own masks because it scared the other workers or violated uniform policy. At the Waterloo plant, while managers in the corporate offices were already working remotely or wearing N95 respirators, the workers on the line were wearing nothing but their hairnets. The disparity was futile. The lords in the castle, the corporate headquarters in Springdale, were safe, conducting meetings on Zoom. The serfs in the field, the slaughterhouses, were dying. The failure was total. The legal system, the political system, and the corporate system had aligned to create a perfect storm of negligence. And in the center of that storm stood the Waterloo pork plant, a facility that was about to become the scene of one of the most grotesque acts of managerial malice in American history. The Tyson Foods pork processing plant in Waterloo, Iowa, is a leviathan of concrete and steel. Sprawling across acres of the American heartland, it consumes 19,500 hogs every single day. Inside its walls, nearly 3,000 workers toil in a labyrinth of steam, dismantling livestock with a speed that blurs the human eye. In April 2020, this facility ceased to be a place of business and transformed into a biological weapon. While the rest of the United States locked its doors and wiped groceries with bleach, the Waterloo plant accelerated. The grow-or-die philosophy of the Tyson dynasty collided head-on with a pandemic that thrived on density. The result was a catastrophic implosion of public health. The plant became a super-spreader engine of such ferocity that it did not just infect the workers, It overwhelmed the entire county, turning Waterloo into one of the highest per capita infection zones in the nation. By early April, rumors of sickness spread through the plant faster than the line speeds. Workers whispered about colleagues disappearing from their stations, about ambulances idling at the loading docks, and about men vomiting in the locker rooms. Yet Tyson Foods maintained a facade of absolute denial. When local elected officials, terrified by the rising case numbers in the community, asked Tyson management if the virus was inside the plant, they were met with a stone wall. On April 10th, despite internal reports indicating a growing cluster of sick employees, plant management publicly stated, "We have no confirmed cases." This was a strategic falsehood designed to keep the line moving. Behind the scenes, the situation was spiraling into chaos. Managers were aware that workers were arriving with fevers. They were aware that the locker rooms, cramped spaces where hundreds of workers changed shifts simultaneously, were effectively gas chambers of viral transmission. Yet the order from Springdale remained unchanged. Production must continue. When workers asked for masks, they were told, according to later lawsuits, that face coverings were unnecessary or even prohibited because they caused panic. The leadership was managing the optics of the disaster, not the safety of the human beings. Black Hawk County Sheriff Tony Thompson, a lawman not easily rattled, decided to breach the corporate wall. After receiving frantic calls from workers' families, he inspected the facility himself. What he saw inside terrified him. He described a scene of industrial anarchy, workers standing elbow to elbow, cutting meat with no protective gear, and a complete lack of social distancing. It was a free-for-all, he later told the press. It shook me to the core. Thompson, along with the local Board of Health, pleaded with Tyson to close the plant for a deep clean and to test the workers. They were ignored. When they threatened to use their legal authority to force a shutdown, Tyson Foods played its trump card, the federal government. Lawyers for the company argued that under President Trump's executive order, local authorities had no jurisdiction to close a critical infrastructure facility. The sheriff of Black Hawk County, the highest law enforcement officer in the jurisdiction, was effectively told to stand down. Tyson Foods had established itself as a sovereign entity, a state within a state, answerable only to its shareholders. Inside the walls, the workforce was a United Nations of the dispossessed. The plant was staffed largely by refugees, Bosnians, Burmese, Congolese, and Marshallese, who relied on a small cadre of interpreters to communicate with management. During the height of the outbreak, these interpreters became the unwilling conduits of a death sentence. In harrowing testimony provided to investigators, interpreters described being forced to call sick workers at home and order them back to the line. They were the ones who had to translate the threats. If you don't come in, you lose your bonus. If you don't come in, you lose your job. They listened to the coughing on the other end of the phone. They heard the pleas of wives and children begging for their fathers to stay home. Yet under pressure from Tyson management, they delivered the message. One interpreter broke down, describing the guilt of sending people into a building they knew was infected. "I felt like I was sending them to the slaughter," they said. Management exploited the language barrier to control the narrative, knowing that a Burmese refugee was less likely to know their rights or call a lawyer. By late April, the biological reality could no longer be suppressed by press releases. The virus tore through the Waterloo plant with the ferocity of a fire in a hayloft. Within weeks, over 1,000 workers, more than a third of the entire workforce, tested positive for COVID-19. Then, the dying started. Sadika Buljic, 58, a Bosnian refugee who had survived the genocide in her homeland only to die in an Iowa hospital, her lungs destroyed by the virus she caught processing pork. Reber Ba, 69, A Marshallese immigrant who worked the line to support his family, dead. Jose Ayala, 44, a team leader who had given years of his life to the company, dead. These were not just statistics. They were the human fuel of the Tyson machine. As the death toll mounted, a macabre scene unfolded inside the plant. Workers who were still standing were forced to work double shifts to cover for the dead and dying. The line speeds did not slow down. If anything, the pressure increased. The air inside the plant was thick with the smell of chlorine and fear. Workers reported crying behind their makeshift masks, praying as they worked, waiting for the tickle in their throat that signaled their turn had come. While the carnage unfolded on the production floor, a very different reality existed in the administrative wing. The plant manager, Tom Hart, and his senior staff had largely retreated from the plant floor. According to lawsuits later filed by the families of the deceased, the managers began to avoid the infected zones. They held their meetings in spacious conference rooms or conducted business from the safety of their offices. But they did not just hide. They watched. And in a display of callousness that would define the moral collapse of the Tyson dynasty, they began to view the unfolding tragedy not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a spectator sport. It was here, in the hallway, outside the administrative offices, that the ultimate betrayal of the social contract took place. As ambulances took workers away, and as the infection rate climbed toward 40%, Tom Hart and his lieutenants did not weep. They did not pray. They reached into their wallets, pulled out cash, and started a game. The full horror of what transpired inside the Waterloo administrative wing might have remained a rumor, whispered among grieving families, had it not been for the death of Isidro Fernandez. Fernandez was a laundry worker at the plant, a man who spent his days handling the blood-soaked smocks and aprons of the slaughter line. He contracted COVID-19 in the chaotic early days of the outbreak and died on April 26, 2020. His death was a tragedy, but his family's grief turned to cold fury when they learned why the plant had remained open. In November 2020, the Fernandez family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Tyson Foods. Embedded within the legal filings was an allegation so grotesque that it initially seemed like the invention of a conspiracy theorist. The lawsuit claimed that while Isidro Fernandez was fighting for every breath on a ventilator, the men responsible for his safety were gambling on his survival. The allegation was specific and damning. Tom Hart, the plant manager of the Waterloo facility, had organized a cash buy-in betting pool among supervisors and managers. The wager? To guess how many of the plant's employees would test positive for COVID-19. Forensic depositions and internal investigations later corroborated the core of the accusation. This was not a metaphorical bet. It was a literal exchange of currency. According to the legal complaints, managers put money into a pot, a winner-take-all fund, based on their predictions of the infection rate. The psychology of this act represents the absolute nadir of the Tyson curse. It was the ultimate manifestation of the dehumanization that had begun with Don Tyson's protein conversion units. To the men running the Waterloo plant, the workers were no longer human beings with families, dreams, and lungs. They were statistical data points in a game of chance. The managers had detached themselves so completely from the suffering on the floor that the death of a worker became a scoring opportunity. The setting of the bet adds a layer of banality to the evil. It reportedly took place in the hallway outside the executive offices, a clean, well-lit space separated from the kill floor by thick doors and air filtration systems. While ambulances screamed into the parking lot to collect the dying, the men in charge stood in a circle, wallets open, laughing as they placed their bets on the body count. It was a scene reminiscent of a dystopian novel, a casino built on top of a morgue. The betting pool was not an isolated incident of madness. It was the logical conclusion of a corporate culture that viewed labor as a disposable input. The lawsuit alleged that Tom Hart, the ringleader of the bet, explicitly referred to the workforce as expendable assets. This language mirrors the terminology used for livestock. In the Tyson worldview, a chicken is an asset to be processed. If it dies before slaughter, it is a loss to be written off. The managers at Waterloo simply applied the same accounting principles to the refugees and immigrants staffing the line. This mindset was reinforced by the top-down pressure from John Tyson and the Springdale headquarters. The managers knew that their bonuses, their promotions, and their job security depended on one metric: pounds of meat produced per day. The health of the workers was not a KPI, key performance indicator. By turning the infection rate into a game, the managers were psychologically inoculating themselves against guilt. They were turning a humanitarian disaster into a spectator sport, distancing themselves from the reality that their decisions were killing the people they were betting on. When the news of the betting pool broke in the national press, the reaction was seismic. It cut through the political noise of the pandemic. Even staunch defenders of corporate liability shields were silenced. There is no political defense for gambling on the deaths of subordinates. Tyson Foods went into full crisis management mode. The company, which had previously defended its safety protocols as world-class, was forced to confront the indefensible. They suspended the managers involved, including Tom Hart, and launched an independent investigation led by former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. However, the corporate response followed the familiar script of the 2003 human trafficking trial, the Bad Apple defense. John Tyson and the executive board framed the betting pool as the rogue action of a few morally bankrupt individuals in Iowa. Completely disconnected from the core values of the company, they fired 7 managers, they issued apologies, they claimed to be upset and shocked. But forensic historians argue that the betting pool was not an anomaly. It was the symptom of the disease. You do not get managers who bet on worker deaths in a vacuum. You get them in a company that smuggles humans, 2001, bribes officials, 1994, and prioritizes grow or die above all else. The betting pool was the flower that bloomed from the soil Don Tyson had tilled 50 years earlier. The managers were fired, but they faced no criminal charges for the bet itself. Gambling on death is morally repugnant, but in the specific context of Iowa law, it was difficult to prosecute as a homicide. The pot of money disappeared. The laughter in the hallway faded. But for the families of the dead, the Fernandez family, the Buljic family, the Ayala family, the betting pool remains the defining image of their loss. They know that while they were praying for a miracle in the ICU, the men who signed the paychecks were hoping to hit the overseas under. The betting pool revealed the true face of the Tyson dynasty in 2020, a face that looked at human suffering and saw only a set of odds. But the moral rot did not stop at the betting pool. While the company was trying to bury the scandal in Waterloo, a far darker secret was festering inside the slaughterhouses across the country. In late 2022 and early 2023, the U.S. Department of Labor launched an investigation that seemed to belong to the Victorian era of Charles Dickens, not the 21st century. Investigators discovered that largely migrant children, some as young as 13 and 14 years old, were working the graveyard shift inside Tyson Foods facilities. These were not teenagers flipping burgers or bagging groceries. They were cleaning the kill floor. The details contained in the federal complaint were horrifying. The children were tasked with scrubbing the most dangerous machinery in the plant, the head splitters, the neck breakers, and the massive razor-sharp bone saws. They worked with caustic chemicals strong enough to burn skin and blind eyes. They worked from 11 p.m. until 5 a.m., often falling asleep in their junior high school classrooms the next morning, their hands raw from chemical burns. The scandal centered on a company called Packers Sanitation Services Incorporated, PSSI, a massive contractor that Tyson Foods hired to clean its plants overnight. When the Department of Labor levied a $1.5 million fine against PSSI for employing over 100 children across 13 meatpacking plants, including Tyson's, the response from Tyson headquarters was immediate and predictable. It wasn't us. Tyson Foods issued statements claiming they had zero tolerance for child labor and that they were unaware of whom their contractors were hiring. They played the plausible deniability card. They argued that because the children's paychecks didn't say Tyson, the moral crime didn't belong to them. But forensic labor experts reject this defense. In a meatpacking plant, security is absolute. You need a badge to enter the gate. You need a badge to enter the floor. Managers are present around the clock. The idea that Tyson executives and plant supervisors did not notice 13-year-olds carrying buckets of acid on the night shift strains credibility. It suggests either gross incompetence or willful blindness. They didn't want to know. The children were cheap. The children were quiet. And just like the undocumented workers of 2001, the children were disposable. The investigation revealed specific cases that underscore the brutality of the Tyson curse. At a Tyson plant in Green Forest, Arkansas, a 14-year-old student was found cleaning the deboning machines. At another facility, a 13-year-old suffered chemical burns so severe they required medical treatment. These children were the newest fuel for the Tyson engine. The dynasty that had started by exploiting local farmers moved on to exploiting undocumented immigrants, and then moved on to gambling on the lives of refugees, had finally circled back to the most vulnerable population of all, children. It was a complete regression of civilization. The wealth of the Tyson family was being scrubbed clean every night by the small, chemically burned hands of middle schoolers. Is the Tyson dynasty finally over? If Don Tyson was the brutal builder and John Tyson was the troubled transitional king, then John R. Tyson, the great-grandson of the founder, was designed to be the perfect product. Born in 1990, he was genetically engineered by the family wealth to break the cycle of rough edges and rural scandals. He didn't go to a state school. He went to Harvard and Stanford. He didn't start on the kill floor in khaki pants. He started in investment banking at J.P. Morgan. In 2019, when he joined the family business, and later in 2022, when he was fast-tracked to the position of Chief Financial Officer, CFO, at the absurdly young age of 32, the narrative was clear. The Tyson family has finally evolved. John R. was polished, articulate, and looked good in a suit. He was the golden boy, meant to signal to Wall Street that Tyson Foods was now a sophisticated, modern corporation, not just a slaughterhouse run by hillbillies. But biology is stubborn. The Tyson curse, that potent cocktail of addiction, entitlement, and recklessness, lay dormant beneath the Stanford MBA. The boardroom believed they had hired a financial prodigy. In reality, they had simply promoted a ticking time bomb with a better haircut. The facade of the golden boy disintegrated on a Sunday morning in November 2022. The incident did not happen in a boardroom or a high-stakes negotiation. It happened in the spare bedroom of a complete stranger in Fayetteville, Arkansas. A local woman returned home to find her front door unlocked. Upon entering, she discovered a trail of clothes leading to her bedroom. There, passed out under her covers, deep in an alcohol-induced coma, lay the CFO of a Fortune 100 company. It was John R. Tyson. The police body cam footage of the arrest is a document of profound corporate humiliation. When officers tried to wake him, the heir to the Tyson empire could not articulate where he was, who he was, or why he was sleeping in a stranger's bed. He was incoherent. The Prince of Poultry was reduced to a trespassing drunk, staring blankly at a flashlight. This was a disaster on multiple levels. First, it was a security nightmare. The CFO of a major corporation had made himself totally vulnerable. Second, it was a PR catastrophe. The image of the 32-year-old executive being shook awake by cops made Tyson Foods look like a clown show. It proved that despite the billions of dollars and the Ivy League degrees, the chaotic DNA of the Tyson bloodline remained dominant. The apple had fallen directly at the base of the poison tree. If the 2022 incident could be spun as a one-time youthful indiscretion, a stretch for a 32-year-old CFO, the events of June 13th, 2024, erased that defense. Less than 2 years after pleading guilty to trespassing and public intoxication, John R. Tyson was arrested again. This time, Arkansas police clocked his silver SUV speeding at 115 miles per hour in a 70 miles per hour zone. When they pulled him over, he reportedly smelled of alcohol and had bloodshot, watery eyes. He failed the sobriety test. He was booked into the Washington County Detention Center, facing charges of driving while intoxicated, DWI, and careless driving. This arrest was the final nail in the coffin of his credibility. It demonstrated a pathological lack of judgment. A man who cannot control his own vehicle is certainly not fit to control the finances of a $53 billion company. Yet, the reaction from the Tyson board of directors was terrifyingly mute. While he was suspended, he was not immediately fired. This hesitation revealed the paralyzing grip of nepotism. In any other public company, a CFO arrested twice in 2 years for alcohol-related offenses would be terminated before the mugshot hit the internet. At Tyson, the bloodline offers a shield that competence cannot pierce. The tragedy of John R. Tyson is not just personal, it is institutional. He represents the end stage of a dynasty. The hunger of the founder, John H., and the ruthless aggression of the builder, Don, have been diluted down to the sheer reckless entitlement of the great-grandson. John R. is not building anything. He is merely surviving the weight of his own name. His repeated arrests send a demoralizing message to the 140,000 workers of Tyson Foods. You can be fired for being 5 minutes late to the kill floor, but the heir can break into a house and drive drunk at 115 miles per hour and keep his title. He is the living embodiment of the Tyson paradox. The family controls the company through a special class of stock that gives them absolute voting power, regardless of their competence. The shareholders are hostages to the genetics of one family. The golden boy turned out to be a liability, a man who poses a greater risk to the company's reputation than any avian flu outbreak. The future of Tyson Foods is currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser, asking for a lawyer. In early 2024, the Tyson curse descended upon the small town of Perry, Iowa, not in the form of a scandal, but in the shape of a padlock. For generations, the Tyson pork plant had been the beating heart of this community, the primary employer that kept the schools funded, the grocery stores open, and the lights on in thousands of homes. But then, the decision came down from the glass headquarters in Springdale. The plant was closing. Over 1,200 workers, men and women who had spent decades destroying their bodies for the company, were fired overnight. To the accountants looking at spreadsheets in Arkansas, this was a simple efficiency adjustment. But to the people of Iowa, it was a death sentence. It was a visceral betrayal of the very heartland that had supported the Tyson family when they were just hauling chickens in a battered truck. The Dynasty was pulling up stakes, leaving behind a Rust Belt ghost town and a workforce with broken backs and no pensions. At the exact same moment that Tyson was firing 1,200 American workers in the Midwest, a radically different scene was unfolding in New York City. Tyson Foods representatives were spotted actively attending job fairs specifically designed to recruit asylum seekers and recent migrants to fill positions in their other facilities. The optical collision of these two events was catastrophic. In a viral moment that ignited the modern culture wars, news broke that Tyson was partnering with the Tent Partnership for Refugees, pledging to hire thousands of migrants. To a polarized American public, the narrative wrote itself. Tyson Foods is firing American citizens in Iowa to hire cheaper, non-unionized migrants in other states. Whether this was a direct replacement strategy or merely a coincidence of corporate logistics didn't matter. The perception was one of economic treason. Conservative media and labor groups alike painted Tyson Foods not as an American success story, but as a globalist entity that viewed American citizenship as an overhead cost to be eliminated. For the first time in its history, the Tyson dynasty faced a threat that their money couldn't bribe, a genuine consumer revolt. The hashtag #boycott Tyson began to trend globally, transforming the brand into a political lightning rod. Families who had purchased Tyson chicken nuggets for decades suddenly refused to touch the products. Investment funds managed by conservative groups began to divest, and the stock price took a hit, not because of earnings, but because of reputational toxicity. Eating Tyson chicken became a statement of political alignment, a sign that one supported open borders and corporate greed. The dynasty found itself in a position it had never experienced before. They were no longer the ones holding the knife. They were the ones on the chopping block. Forensic historians note a grim symmetry in this 2024 scandal, as it marks the completion of a cycle of exploitation started by Don Tyson 50 years ago. The demographic of the victim has changed, but the predation remains constant. In the 1970s, they exploited local independent farmers. In the 1990s, they exploited poor rural whites and African Americans. In the 2000s, they trafficked undocumented immigrants. And now, in the 2020s, they have pivoted to asylum seekers and refugees. The Tyson business model is fundamentally parasitic. It requires a host population that is desperate, voiceless, and cheap. The boycott of 2024 was the collective realization by the American public that the empire wasn't just feeding them, it was feeding on them. When we step back and examine the full forensic timeline of the Tyson dynasty, from the Great Depression to the present day, we do not see a story of American progress. We see a terrifying case study in moral devolution. The trajectory of the bloodline is a straight line down, a descent into madness that mirrors the degradation of the industry they built. It began with John H. Tyson, a hardscrabble trucker who was physically obliterated by the industrial age he tried to harness. It passed to Don Tyson, a ruthless tyrant in khaki pants who viewed living creatures as biological machines and turned cruelty into a patented business model. It fractured with John Tyson, a tortured heir who traded his father's brutality for a suit and a drug addiction, presiding over human trafficking rings and betting pools on human life. And finally, it has landed on John R. Tyson, a drunken princeling stumbling into strangers' beds, proof that the genetic vitality of the clan has completely exhausted itself. The legacy of Tyson Foods is not the chicken on the dinner plate. It is the carnage required to put it there. This is an empire that has consistently treated the world as a disposable resource. They poisoned the rivers of Arkansas with phosphorus until the water turned black. They broke the backs of independent farmers, turning landowners into serfs on their own soil. They trafficked human beings across borders like cattle, exploited the labor of children on the night shift, and gambled on the lungs of refugees during a plague. At every single crossroads, where the family had to choose between human dignity and profit margin, they chose the margin. Today, the Tyson family stands as one of the wealthiest clans in the history of the United States. They possess private jets, vast estates, and the ear of politicians, but they preside over a kingdom of ghosts. Their name is no longer synonymous with nourishment, but with a specific kind of industrial horror. They have won the game of capitalism, but in the process, they have butchered their own soul. The Tyson curse is not a supernatural hex cast by a witch. It is the inevitable rotting fruit of the seeds they planted. They built a cathedral of bones, and now they are trapped inside it, ruled by a clown prince, waiting for the walls to finally collapse under the weight of a century of sin.